ask anybody's question but yours. You're an idiot. And really a disloyal person.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Disloyal Idiots podcast here on the Fans First Sports Network. I'm Christian Guzman, joined by Andy Pregler, as we talk about all things Syracuse Orange related, especially now that fall ball is going, and as we hope that Syracuse's season does not get decided by 1 millimeter. Andy, how you doing?
Listen, before we even get into the soccer, the answer is you play better in your opening 3 games, so you play South Africa instead of Sweden. But, you know, that's just me being a little bit too picky about things?
No, because scoring goals makes, a sense.
Anyways, I get it. I get why this happened for the team. But I am slightly annoyed that we might come out of this Women's World Cup and talk about all the wrong things when it comes to this team. But it doesn't matter because we are not a soccer podcast as much as we try to be. We are, in fact, a Syracuse sports podcast. So naturally, we are going to talk about the Pac-12 to open things off here. Isn't that right?
You mean the Pac-5?
I mean the Pac. We need to desperately figure out our shit in the next 12 months.
It's the Pac Apple.
I don't know if that Apple deal is going to be around for next year. For those
I highly doubt it also.
For those who might be living under a rock, news broke this weekend that the Pac-12 is going to do what is essentially the college football equivalent of an Irish wake. They have been rated by the Big Ten and the the Big 12 for most of their member schools of note. The wave of conference realignment has begun in the sense that this was a conference that showed weakness with their inability to get a TV deal over the line in a timely fashion, and their member schools wanted financial stability. So I think the natural question in this setting is, what does this mean for Syracuse? And what it doesn't mean is that the ACC is falling apart anytime soon. No matter what Florida State tries to do, the grant of rights is one of the best written legal contracts in the history of mankind, in the fact that it is incredibly difficult to find a way out that doesn't involve paying half of a Saudi payroll in order to break said grant of rights if you're Florida State or Clemson.
Well,
we'll get to that in a second. But the general idea is that the ACC and Syracuse is set until at least 2030. We've seen that with most of these conference realignment deals or abdications that schools are doing, they usually take about 3 years to be in the works. I think a lot of the news about the current situation with the Pac-12, we're seeing that the timeline roughly matches up for when those university presidents and athletic directors started seriously considering their moves. So for Syracuse and the ACC, it might seem like there's pressure to do a move now. There's not, because of the grant of rights. They're pretty in there. But yeah, Christian, I guess we kind of just jokingly alluded to it. At this point, it would take something like the Saudis deciding to essentially front Florida State the money and become the equivalent of that shady dude who loans you money in order for Florida State to actually leave. But it does appear as if the ACC is in this weird spot where addition doesn't necessarily make sense based off of the schools that are available to add. But it does feel weird to just sit on your hands and do nothing as the sport fundamentally changes around you.
It's also really tough because unlike the Big Ten and the Big 12, the ACC is an Eastern conference. It's all of their schools are in the Eastern time zone. And so, yes, while the moves to add the Pac-12 teams are a little bit weird from the Big Ten and Big 12 in terms of just location. It makes it even less so for the ACC just in terms of that location as well. And we've already seen a number of the Olympic sport athletes from the schools that are leaving the Pac-12 come out and just talk about the logistical problems that they're going to have with their families and trying to, support their children and watching their games and supporting their games wherever they go. And so, in that case, while the ACC may have wanted to add an Oregon or Washington based on what was all happening around, like it makes a little bit less sense location wise than it would for the Big Ten or the Big 12. And which leaves Syracuse in that position, not Syracuse, at least the ACC in that position where you really do have to kind of stick with the Eastern schools. And what we know about the ACC as well is that the conference in general is going to only add schools that have similar academic integrity. Not integrity is not the right word, but similar academic rigor to its other member institutions. And so that your point being there's not that many great schools out there that the ACC might want to add is basically because of that strict academic rigor that the ACC schools want to have their members hold up to it in a standard. And
yeah, I think we're in this very weird position where the ACC is the last conference with a true identity beyond being good at football. Like the SEC is definitely regionalized more so than any other league, and it is based entirely around football success, hence adding Oklahoma and Texas and expanding that footprint into the South Midwest area, depending on how granular you want to be with your geographic designations of this country. But the thing with the ACC having this additional standard that it wants to add to, I think a lot of people are looking at it as a detriment to their addition. But I spent a lot of the last few days listening to a lot of college football podcasts, naturally. And one of the things that came up in the split zone duo is that there's a lot of these schools that are now going to be afterthoughts, not necessarily outside of the Big Ten or the SEC, but inside the Big Ten and the SEC as well. Like if you're a South Carolina, yes, you're delivering the state of South Carolina to the SEC, but Clemson's the better program. The bigger school has more fans. If you're a Mississippi State, like why are they keeping both you and Ole Miss around? Like there's Stephen Godfrey is saying that the next round of this isn't going to be more expansion. It's going to be more consolidation around the Tiffany programs and around the schools that actually drive eyeballs and revenue for the leagues. And so I think if you're the ACC, not necessarily adding right now is not the worst thing in the world, because there's still a lot of dominoes to fall from here on out. And yes, that revenue gap is going to continue to grow. But unlike the Big Ten, which is now beholden to Fox and NBC's streaming decisions that they make with their own individual platforms. So just letting you know now, when Michigan, Ohio State is put behind the Peacock paywall in 2030 or in 2028, I'm calling it now, just saying. But the biggest thing is going to be looking at schools like a Cal and a Stanford. They would make a ton of sense to add to the ACC, but not when they're the only schools on the West Coast. Like, I think you could look at a Rice and a Tulane and say, like, there's a nice way to start expanding your way west, but you're still running into the same issues where a soccer game between Tulane and Syracuse is going to cost you a good chunk of that increased television revenue you're chasing by expansion. So for the ACC, expansion doesn't really work unless you can add a bunch of schools all at once that make the logistics of this conference work. And one thing that the ACC has been abundantly clear on is, and maybe it'll be to their detriment, is that it's more than just about football. The ACC cares about the fact that they consistently win national titles in Olympic sports. They care about the fact that basketball in the ACC carries clout and is a national conversation when Duke and North Carolina play each other. These are things that obviously I think we said about the old Big East before the old Big East fell apart because they didn't prioritize football enough. But I don't think the ACC is in a situation where it's not prioritizing football enough. It's just looking at the football landscape and saying, if the playoff is going to expand, which we expect it to, and the top 5 conferences automatically get a playoff team, we will, us being the ACC, we will guarantee that our conference champion goes to the playoff every year. If you expand it to 18 teams, or if you expand it to 12 teams, how much of the Big Ten and SEC beat up on each other and knock each other out of that system? And we don't know yet. Maybe what will happen, and I think the thing that I'm most scared about as a Syracuse fan, is that if Syracuse has a 10-2 or a 10-2 season in the ACC, how does that stack up against an 8-4 season from the Big Ten or the SEC? Does Syracuse and the ACC still get that playoff spot for an at-large team that's finishing in the top 10 in most years in the AP and coaches poll? Or do you give it to one of the big 2 conferences because they're playing helmet school, they're playing helmet recognizable matchups week in and week out for 12 weeks? And the real answer here is that we don't know. And I kind of like, and this is just me finally putting a pin on this very rambling topic, I actually don't hate the ACC sitting around and waiting to see what happens when that playoff gets expanded, when the SEC deal and the Big Ten deal are expired, before the grant of rights deal even goes up for renegotiations starting in 2030. Like, there are still so many things that we don't know. And there are so many now that this sport is inexplicably tied to TV capitalism, which is probably one of the most fickle bubbles out there. Like, I don't mind having the stability and saying, like, let's see how this all plays out before we start making and doing crazy things like adding a football game in Stanford, California for 8 times a year.
And unlike the situation where the Big East schools fled for the ACC, there hasn't been this many teams changing conferences this quickly. I don't think ever, especially not with how aggressive and how much money TV contracts play into all of the negotiation and realignment that's happening right now. And so I think, like you, I think that it's not necessarily a bad thing, because we could be in a situation where in a couple of years, once all the, not even just with the playoff, but once all the alignment has settled down, and now that all the new schools are established for not even a year, maybe 2 years in their new conferences, we could see oversaturation problems that could also benefit the ACC, because how also, yes, maybe a quote unquote 10-2 Syracuse record doesn't look that great against an 8-4 Ole Miss record, but that Ole Miss team may have not played Oklahoma and Auburn and Florida in a season because of the amount of saturation in that schedule. And so maybe the amount of teams creates even more headaches. That also, you got to remember, yes, there's a lot of money going into these contracts, but that means there's more money that has to be split to the schools that are now joining these conferences as well. And so the percentage of money that all of these schools are getting is going to be eventually less by the time the reported percentage revenue gets increased as a school is more years into a conference.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really great point. For those that didn't see, Oregon and Washington in their first year of the Big Ten are going to be getting about $30 million in revenue sharing, while every other school in the conference is expected to get somewhere north of 90 million per school. And that number is only going up by $1 million per year for Oregon and Washington until the next deal gets renegotiated with the Big Ten and their TV partners. That number is lower than the estimated $35 million a year payout that the ACC gives to each of its member schools on an annual basis. So part of the reason why that existed is because obviously Oregon and Washington were desperate because of the Pac-12, and the Big Ten could add them at a rate that is more than most were willing to offer, but is still lower than what you see. But I think that assuages a lot of fears for people who are saying, oh, the ACC is going to fall apart if Florida State and Clemson leave. I don't think the Big Ten really wants Florida or Clemson that badly that it is willing to help them pay the $500 million in exit fees on top of giving them the full percentage of revenue sharing every year, which, as you're mentioning, goes down by adding Clemson and Florida State to the league. So, like, at least right now, the money is obviously the reason that this is all happening. But the reason that this is happening right now is because the Pac-12 doesn't have any money. This isn't a situation where schools would like to have more money. They already have an obscene amount of money, and they would like an even more obscene amount of money. The Pac-12 drained its entire revenue resources in the failed Pac-12 network experiment, and they did not have a TV deal lined up for next season. And the money that is now being reported as part of that TV deal, which you just posted in our News Magician Slack, The Athletic is reporting it's only $23 million a year per school. That most assuredly will not exist for next year now with this new breakdown. So this is comparing the Pac-12 and the ACC is literally comparing apples and oranges because they, no pun intended about the Washington Apple Cup and the Orange Bowl. It's just fundamentally, when we look at the financials of both situations, the Pac-12 was that business that you knew was going to have the for rent sign in the window any day now. The ACC is the business that you're looking at and going, well, they're clearly making a profit. They're just not making as much of a profit as the big box stores. And you're assuming that they're going to go out of business. But as we've seen in today's modern age, there's ways for these smaller, more localized enterprises to have better revenue margins than the big box stores if they play their cards right. And that is a big if caveat that I'm adding to this analogy.
So what you're saying is that the ACC is your typical mom and pop store that is probably selling a better product than some of your major retailers, and the Pac-12 is Applebee's or Olive Garden.
Christian, what would you rather have? Would you rather have a quesadilla, a lukewarm quesadilla burger that is Iowa, Oregon on a Saturday night at 10:30 p.m. on Peacock? Or would you rather have a Clemson Syracuse at 2:30 p.m. on ESPN2?
Well, hey, in recent years, that game's on ABC.
Fair. I guess it's more of a Pitt Syracuse on ESPN2 if I'm being more fair here.
This year that's going to be on the CW.
No, it'll be on the ACC network, right in between 5 different ads for Sportles or whatever that thing is called.
Oh man, how long we've gone without our needed ACC network random regional ads.
I will say my wife is somebody who enjoys watching Syracuse sports in the way that she likes to know what I'm going to be mad about for the upcoming week. But the ACC, the weird ACC ads do add a weird level of perverse happiness and entertainment in watching, Syracuse Colgate.
And that means you haven't brought a tack like yet?
I really wanted to buy the Spurtle thing because I was like, that actually looks like it might be helpful, and a lot of our wooden utensils are starting to finally, potentially go after all these years. So stay tuned. I might join Nicole Auerbach in succumbing to the ACC advertisements for the 5th time during a Syracuse Western Michigan game this year. But Christian, I think the bow on this whole thing is that the natural conversation talking point that we're getting to right now, it's the one that everybody brings up. Split Zone Duo brought it up when I was listening to their podcast. The Athletic has mentioned it. Pretty much anybody with a pulse who follows college sports is asking, when does Syracuse, Pitt, BC, Miami break off and reform the Big East in some sort of football capacity? And I don't know about you. I don't necessarily want that yet, but I am intrigued by the option if we really do go down the route where there's only going to be the ACC or the SEC and the Big Ten. If the ACC is going to die and Syracuse is not going to exist in the Big Two, I'm fine with the Big East. But until then, I'd rather stay in the ACC for the knowledge that the money and the athletic resources that we get from the ACC right now are far more than what the Big East is getting per school. I think the Big East TV contract is only something like $4 or $5 million per school right now.
Yeah, me too. I think right now, like that's the ACC financial, and again, this all goes back to money. But as we continue to see, the ACC, the move to the ACC, Syracuse has continued to work out financially better for them than if they stayed in the Big East. I think that's a fair assumption to make. And for all the people who want the Syracuse just in general to go back to the Big East, the money just doesn't make sense, especially now, right at this time, based on where the conferences are, where the schools are, what position that they're in. So if the ACC does fold, yeah, Syracuse should create some sort of a Northeast region with Pitt, bring back UConn for all we care, bring back Louisville. Maybe if West Virginia is interested again, why not? But like, hell, if Maryland feels like they're not getting anywhere in the Big Ten, if they want to shout again, sure. But I think it's right now unless you're Florida State and you're looking to become Newcastle of America, you don't have that much want or need to move away from the ACC.
Yeah, definitely agree there. Wow, right now I'm just taking a look at the Big East. Yeah, right now the Big East payouts are not
Exactly.
the right money is going up, but we're talking about around, oh my goodness. Yeah, it's less than like 5 million per school right now.
And like
Which is
and let's be honest, like also like Kevin brings this up on our Slack all the time when people bring up like Syracuse should go back to the Big East. What would you rather see? Syracuse versus Georgia Tech and Syracuse versus BC right now, or Syracuse versus Wake Forest? Or do you want to see Syracuse versus Creighton? No offense to Creighton, but like that's not what
right.
like Syracuse. If you're going back to the Big East just because of nostalgia and UConn and St. John's, there's not much other incentive for Syracuse to join the Big East back right now.
Right. And I think the caveat to that is everything is right now.
Yeah.
Should things implode and there's more football options and a lot of these schools that we're talking about are left in the dark and we're able to create some kind of Northeast corridor of a conference that has football and basketball viability, absolutely. We should investigate bringing that back, but that doesn't exist right now. But unless something magically changes, I think it's pretty clear that Syracuse is going to be any school that is not a large land grant university is in trouble right now. And Clemson is one of those schools that is not, because they're really good at football. And the recipe for Syracuse is really simple. Get really good at football or start planning for what happens to the ACC when the grant of rights becomes affordable to break around 2030. That's what, I don't know if it's going to be John Wildhack making these decisions and guiding this vision, but the athletic director of Syracuse, that's your situation that you're stuck in right now.
Well, I mean, the getting good at football part, though, is probably the more pressing issue.
It is a more pressing issue, and we'll get into what we expect for that coming up right after we give you a word from our sponsor. Home Field Apparel is back sponsoring the Disloyal Idiots podcast. Christian, I decided to do something fun. If you're watching the live stream right now, I just came back from a wedding back home, and I came home to this wonderful bag sitting on my porch. You see it on the stream. It is a bag that says "Wear One for the Team." It is from Home Field. It is my most recent order that I made, and I'm going to open this up to show everybody the amazing, wonderful vintage clothing that you get from Home Field Apparel when you order online from them. They used to send and wrap everything in like old newspaper, which was pretty cool. But now they send it to you in this really nice, like waterproof plastic bag, because the one time that they sent me something, the FedEx driver, who's probably a UConn fan, dropped it in a puddle outside my house. So they've learned. They've continually gotten better with their products, and I now am the proud owner of a quarter zip with the old Syracuse logo from the 80s and 90s on it. This thing is soft as fuck. Holy shit. Every time I get something from them, it's just so soft. I can't wait to wear this when it finally cools down here in New York. But if you want to be like me and wear wonderful Home Field Apparel clothing and get these fun packages that they send you, you should head over to homefieldapparel.com and use promo code NUNES23, NUNES23, to get 15% off your first order from Home Field Apparel. They obviously have a fantastic Syracuse collection. They are also currently refreshing a lot of their schools. This week is the Big 12 week. I believe we have Missouri, Kansas, some of those big actual schools that are staying in the Big 12 or used to be in the Big 12 in the case of Missouri. So if you're a fan of Syracuse, if you're a fan of any team, if you're a fan of just feeling comfortable, head over to Home Field Apparel and make sure to use promo code NUNES23.
The Disloyal Idiots podcast. It's not just a podcast. We do unboxings as well.
Look, we have to diversify our offerings, Christian, in this ever-evolving media landscape, okay? Wow, that is the most corporate thing I've said.
Yeah, I was about to say. Wow.
Oh, man, shoot me now. Anyways, speaking of...
I didn't know it was Home Field that, corrupted Andy at the ultimate level now.
Yeah, I'm going to blame my day job for that. However... If you do want to talk about coach speak and not getting straight answers out of somebody, let's go to our old friend Dino Babers.
Oh, yes.
We actually had a pretty direct quote from Dino this time on probably the biggest situation going into spring football camp. They began practice early this week. It was Wednesday was the first official day of fall camp. So obviously we'll be having updates on the site. You should be going to Syracuse.com and checking out our friends over there who will be doing updates as well on camp. But one of the things that Dino Babers was remarkably blunt about is that Garrett Schrader is on a pitch count. So Garrett Schrader had a undisclosed arm shoulder surgery this offseason, and it appears that Syracuse would like to ease him back into things. The exact quote from Dino Babers: on Garrett now, we've got to put him on a pitch count. There will be times when he's going through practice and all of a sudden, boom, he'll be out of practice. Hopefully it'll just be us being cautious with him and not anything else. Don't read into that unless you're asking a question directly. I'll tell you right now, if it's an injury, you'll probably know about it. The Schrader spoke a little bit last week and said that the surgery was to, quote, fix a chronic issue. It appears as if Schrader's been playing with some pain for some time or some discomfort of some kind for some time. And the hope here is that the arm is strengthened and the arm is more flexible after the surgery. Christian, you and I are both baseball fans, and my first fear was that he had undergone Tommy John surgery.
Me too.
It doesn't,
the
timetable doesn't match that. It doesn't seem as if it's like that. But the fact that he is on a pitch clock does make me worry that this was not a minor surgery that he underwent.
We know it was his elbow. First of all, we know that. We know that it was his elbow, and we know it was on his throwing arm. He didn't practice at all during the spring. He had that pretty hefty cast on it during the spring practices as well. timeline-wise, I'm spitballing here because I don't know too many similar elbow injuries that would keep you out for probably 4 months.
I think I know what it is.
I'm guessing bone spur, but that's probably not it.
No, I mean, Bone Spur would be fantastic. Well, it would not fantastic for him, but like that
Yeah.
would be a fantastic guess. I think that does fit. The other one it might be is I just remembered that Ben Roethlisberger in his in one of the last years, he had a very similar looking cyborg brace that Schrader was wearing. And I was hoping that the Steelers disclosed what it was. And the Steelers never did, but Roethlisberger did. He had to reattach flexor tendons in his throwing elbow that had become detached over time. And it's very similar to Tommy John, where they take the tendon, they add new anchors to the bone, and they reattach it. And Roethlisberger was also on a throwing program as part of his rehab and recovery from that. So I think either one of these options would line up with the timeline that we've seen and why Syracuse is being so careful with Schrader, because both of these surgeries require going into a very sensitive part of anybody. Like if you or I got this surgery, we would need to go through physical therapy to relearn how to click a mouse, how to type, how to do very basic things with our hands. And we're talking about throwing a football at incredibly hard velocities.
You know what? This is going to sound crazy, but probably not crazy at the same time. This might trace back to the Schrader helicopter play.
That would make a ton of sense, because didn't he take the impact on the throwing arm?
I don't remember exactly. I'm actually going to look up the video now because I'm very curious where it was he landed. But I know it was on his back, and it didn't look great. Let's put it that way.
Yes.
And to make my point, just a long story short, this is going to be very careful how they do this, because as we know in baseball, whenever you have an arm injury to a throwing arm, you have to be very careful about how you treat that arm coming back. And so, yes, this makes sense, but there's also added caveat of you can't be too careful as well.
Yes. I think the biggest thing for me is, again, listening to my podcast. I listened to them do the ACC preview show, which is how I got on a split zone duo rabbit hole for the weekend. I think that one of the things that we're going to talk about consistently during these practices, and something that the split zone duo group was talking about, is that there is a pathway for Syracuse to get to 7 or 8 wins and break the cycle that Dino has been in, where the team takes a step back and then has a huge valley. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't trip down this pathway and end up in a valley. That is very available with this year's schedule. But the schedule is done in such a way that Syracuse can start the year 4-0, come out of its worst stretch of the year 4-3, and have a very winnable back half of the season. The problem is that all of that hinges on Garrett Schrader's health, because what we saw last year, and what the split zone doer guys were talking about, which is very true, so much of what makes Syracuse's offense tick, especially last year early in the year, was that defenses had to respect that Schrader could break contain on a play and run for 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, insert any amount of yardage that's positive on a design pass play. And on when Syracuse is running the zone reads that they're doing, you basically take away one of your best run stuffers to watch Schrader. And it opens up so much more for the offense. And the minute that you can either take away Schrader's ability to throw the ball, which we saw last year, or his ability to run the ball, which we also saw last year, the defense suddenly doesn't have to respect that. And the entire playbook is built around Schrader's versatility. And so when you take away that versatility, the playbook becomes incredibly easy to scout for and prepare against. And we saw that in the back half of the year, when even though Schrader was playing, he was remarkably ineffective because defenses didn't respect him either to throw the ball or to run the ball.
And so two things. One, I just referenced the video. That elbow landed pretty hard, so I wouldn't be surprised if it definitely traced back to that helicopter play back at Mississippi State. The other thing, there's a couple of points I want to make here. One, the other thing that goes along with this scheduling thing is because of that 3-game stretch, those are 3 pretty physical teams. For those of you who don't know what we're talking about, it's Clemson, Florida State, and UNC. Syracuse plays those 3 teams back to back to back and then has a bye. And what we saw last year was Syracuse had a very similar type of brutal stretch of games. It was Clemson, Notre Dame, and Florida State. And what we saw happen is that when you got to the winnable games towards the end of the year, Pitt, Wake Forest, Syracuse didn't have the bodies to play like they did at the beginning of the season. And because of that, Syracuse looked remarkably worse in games that fans probably thought they had a fighting chance in, especially given how the beginning of the season went. And we've already talked a lot this preseason, preseason, about how little depth in terms of proven quality is behind these presumed number 1 starters. So if Syracuse starts dropping bodies like it has in previous years under Dino Babers, and the Orange now have to, just out of pure necessity, go to those unproven talents in those winnable games, it gets really tricky to see how Syracuse can capitalize on the quote-unquote easier back half of the schedule if they get really banged up during that 3-game stretch. And as we've kind of alluded to a couple of times on this podcast, this will be my final point on this. It's this year and next year that are big points that Syracuse has to start going for it in terms of pushing towards those 8-9 win seasons, because 2025 is a brutal dip back, brutal dip back to reality, just in terms of what we think schedule-wise is going to be a brutal season for Syracuse.
Yeah, we've talked about it at first. I was looking this up the other day just to for my own personal things. This year's non-conference schedule is obviously very good if you're a fan of winning games. Colgate, Western Michigan, at Purdue, Army. Again, most smart people seem to think that Syracuse should go through that stretch 4-0, which is fantastic. Next year, a lot of the same thing. Ohio, at Army, Holy Cross, UConn, at a location to be determined that will probably be Yankee Stadium. Just warning you all ahead of time. But the 2025 season, we open the season in week 0 against Tennessee in Atlanta, Georgia for the Chick-fil-A kickoff game. I will be there. The next year, with a game at Notre Dame. 2026, a game at Notre Dame. Rest of the non-conference schedule is New Hampshire, Army, UConn. Not too bad. And then 27 starts the Penn State series.
No, I forgot about that. Oh, man.
Yeah, 27, 28 is Penn State, and 29 is Notre Dame again. So, yeah, there's a lot happening there, obviously, but trying to bring us back to this season and specifically to the quarterback room. I do think that one of the more interesting things about this Garrett Shrader pitch count situation is that it means by nature, Dino and the staff have a built-in excuse to try to figure out who their backup quarterback is and what the gap is for between, your starter and your backup. Because I think last year, we were all a little surprised at how big of a gap there seemed to be between Carson Del Rio Wilson and Garrett Shrader. I think both of us here are really high on Carson Del Rio Wilson.
Carlos, by the way.
Carlos. Dang, why did I want to say Carson?
Do you have Steve Carson on your mind?
Probably. But that is... Yeah, Carlos Del Rio Wilson is somebody who we both have high expectations for, but just didn't have it last year. And to be frank, it was a tough situation. He's young, first year in the program. I totally understand. There's got to be a big jump, dude. He's got to take a jump during the season, and hopefully he took a jump during spring ball, and will continue to make that jump in the fall. But the other thing that's in there, and this was on Emily Liker's 10 things to watch going into the position battles and players to watch for the preseason. Go read this whole thing. I don't know if everybody remembers, but quarterback Brandon Davis transferred in, and he had been at the University of South Carolina, former 4-star recruit from Delaware, who had not been offered by Syracuse the first time around, but they've added him to the quarterback room. And so having Davis and Del Rio Wilson competing for that backup spot seems like a pretty clear move by the coaching staff to tell Del Rio Wilson, look, you came in as a highly rated transfer. We gave you some time to play last year, and you clearly were not better than the highly rated transfer that we had who had gotten hurt the first time through. We're bringing in another highly rated transfer, and the three of Schrader is obviously the starting quarterback. Schrader is obviously going to get hurt at some time this season. Either Davis or Del Rio Wilson is going to be asked to step up, and I would really like to see one of them be the clear number 2 and close that gap in quality between Schrader and whoever the backup ends up being.
At least the exciting thing is, for the first time in a while, we actually have a backup battle instead of a starting battle this time around. The last time we've had, it was Dungy and DeVito, and then DeVito and Schrader. And now we have an interesting battle of guys who are capable backups who have flashes of potential to be a starter. And so and one way that falls into the good problem to have camp for Syracuse. But as you alluded to a little bit earlier, the drop off from Schrader to Del Rio Wilson was massive. And a lot of that was also just due to natural play style. Del Rio Wilson had mobility, but not quite the same mobility that Schrader had. Schrader was more intuitive in his mobility. And while Del Rio Wilson, I think, had to think a lot more in terms of what he wanted to do once he was outside the pocket. And also, Del Rio Wilson was just a more natural long ball thrower, where the offense in general last season was built around the short to mid passing game, because that's what Schrader's strengths were and still are, I'm assuming, especially now with a reconstructed elbow. So, and just a difference of philosophy wise, Del Rio Wilson wasn't necessarily the best fit for a quarterback of his skill set. So now this also creates an interesting problem for Jason Beck. It's, how it's there are some offensive coordinators who will flip systems completely when a new quarterback comes in and adjust the style of offense, the style of play to that quarterback's strengths. I'm not sure Jason Beck's going to do that or not. It probably more likely is leaning towards the not route, especially when Syracuse is expecting Garrett Schrader to play all 12 games of the regular season. Us as fans, like Andy said, we're expecting Garrett Schrader to get hurt at some point and miss some sort of time. So it could just end up being between Del Rio Wilson and Davis, not who is the better quarterback, but who is the better quarterback in the system that Jason Beck wants to run. Because while, like you and I, like you said, we're both very high on what talent Del Rio Wilson seems to have. And that was evident in just the limited sample size we had last year watching him. Just looking at him, he looks like he's going to have a very high ceiling, especially with that long ball that he has with his arm. However, that's not the right system for how Syracuse played last year. And if we're going off the assumption that Jason Beck is like his teacher in Robert Ane, he's probably not going to change his system if Schrader goes down again. And so if Braden Davis shows that he is going to not only be a guy who's willing to escape the pocket when the offensive line inevitably collapses from a 3-man rush, or is going to also be comfortable with a short to mid throwing game and find Rondé Gatson the minute he hits a curl route after going 10 yards downfield, then Davis is your guy instead of Del Rio Wilson.
Yeah, and I think the only quote that we have about Davis is from Damian Alford, who said that, Davis seems versatile and he's enjoying his time playing with him. Nice veteran answer there from a veteran player on the roster. I think that hopefully we'll have a good idea about this during the 4 non-conference games. Colgate is obviously not very good. I would expect Schrader to play very minimally in that game, probably, maybe the first half. And then you let Del Rio Wilson and Davis each take a quarter in the second half if the competition is still close. Western Michigan is another team that is expected to be in the bottom half of the MAC. We've seen Syracuse play good MAC teams pretty non-competitively, looking at that Ohio game from a couple years ago with Tommy DeVito, where he looked amazing. And it turns out that even though Ohio was a good team, Syracuse was just, there's a pretty big gap right now between the Power 5 and the Group of 5, especially early in the season. And so if Western Michigan is going to be bad, even if Syracuse is not going to be great, we probably win that one pretty easily. Similar situation there. It's not really until the Purdue game that you need to have your ducks in a row when it comes to, okay, who's the first team offense, who's the first team defense. And I think that gives us an opportunity in September to actually see some of, Del Rio Wilson and Davis in game action, kind of evaluate their decision-making skills, see how comfortable they look behind the offensive lines. I'm cautiously optimistic that we'll see some of that stuff in the beginning of the season, thanks to how kind the schedule is set up this year. So that way, it gives us something to talk about in those expected blowout games. But as you mentioned, we don't necessarily know if Del Rio Wilson has added mobility to be more factored into his overall skill set. We don't know what kind of quarterback Davis really is in the Syracuse system. Getting those questions answered won't just help us out for this year, but could be really instrumental into figuring out which one of these guys, if any of them, enter into the portal this offseason or are expected to take that next step up and replace Schrader once his eligibility runs out at the end of this season.
The thing to put a bow on this is just you got to be. Syracuse has to be careful on this also, and by Syracuse I mean Syracuse fans, because what we've seen from Dino is that for some strange reason he's also been reluctant to take starters out of blowout games. I remember last year during the Wagner game, the starters played deep into the third quarter, and once the backups came also, it seemed like Syracuse had switched to a more conservative run out the clock play calling style. And so while yes, it's a great way, to get the game over with, it's also not a great way to, evaluate your options of what you have against actual opponents who are assuming going to be trying just as hard as you guys, especially when you think about a Colgate or a Western Michigan. Those are guys who maybe on, if whether it's their first team out or second team out, those are guys who are still going to want to prove themselves to their coaching staff for when their important conference games roll around. And so to do something well, even against the twos of a Power 5 school, is going to do well in their book. And so Syracuse doesn't give them too much to do in terms of the play with. It's just a waste of time for both teams. And so that's something that as Syracuse fans we have to be careful about in terms of our expectations, because the decision making in terms of what you can do in a blowout game has been questionable at times from the Syracuse coaching staff, especially under Dino Babers.
Nope, you are 100% right there, and I think that it's something that we definitely need to look out for a little bit more this season. But this is not the only major injury coming out of the first week of camp. The other major injury is on the other side of the ball. Stephon Thompson was in a non-contact jersey to open the first day of camp. There were 4 players that were in non-contact jerseys. Again, this is from Emily Leichler of Syracuse.com. Stephon Thompson, tight end Dan Villari, linebacker Austin Roon, and then walk-on corner Cam Reardon. Babers said that he, quote, has not been given a timeline, and that it's most likely that these players are going to have the most action this week when there are no pads or minimal pad work being done next week. So for everybody who's watching this live or everybody who's watching this on Monday, this week pads go on, probably going to see less of these players and any other player who is in a non-contact jersey as pad work gets underway. And no disrespect to Valari, no disrespect to Austin Rune. Stephon Thompson's not a name we want to see on the injury list. And he is a player that the Orange have been without since the beginning of 2022. And if they are without him in 2023, I am officially capital W worried, capital C concerned, capital whatever other adjective you would like to use in there for the defense.
The good thing, the silver lining that you have on that Thompson injury is that you do have a backup Sam linebacker who is experienced, at least, in playing the position, and that's Derek McDonald. Now, McDonald is not the same player as Thompson. That was much very evident last year. And they actually play pretty different roles and style of play as well. But as we talked about earlier, the drop off between the 1s and 2s this year is drastic, and it's walking off a cliff drastic. But in some positions, it's not. And luckily for Syracuse, in the same position where Thompson plays, you do have McDonald, who basically played the entire year, or at least 2/3 of it, before he got injured himself, as that backup Sam linebacker. And so you do have experience there. It is going to leave, Syracuse without another weapon. And then that's where you have at Syracuse the necessity to rely on that unproven will linebacker that we're expecting Syracuse to trot out someone new there, whether it be McDonald moving over to that will, whether it be Leon Lowry or Anwar Sparrow, who takes over that position as well. So it's not ideal, but it could be worse.
Yeah, I'm just concerned because I think one of the things that we're not talking about a ton is that the last year we saw a really dynamic defense in terms of players that could make a difference at all three levels. We saw defensive linemen capable of disrupting plays. We saw linebackers capable of disrupting plays. And we saw defensive backs capable of disrupting plays. Unfortunately, unless somebody really takes a step up, it appears that the only group of disruptors is coming out of that linebacker core, which isn't bad. As a Steelers fan, I have watched enough football where the linebackers are doing the majority of that work, and it can happen. But in order for that to be what Syracuse's defense is, you're going to need to have both Thompson and Wax in there. I don't think that you can just have one or the other and really expect the defense to be all that disruptive. Now, they might, be able to bend and not break, but I don't expect them to be able to get behind the line of scrimmage and get to the quarterback and then, cause those big splash plays that last year really did bail out the defense in a lot of big opportunities and in a lot of big ways. Like that Clemson game comes to mind where the defense was doing so much to disrupt Clemson's timing and at all three levels. And if you don't have that this year, you're going to really rely on the one group that you have to do the most work. And Thompson's a big part of that equation if the defense is going to be a difference maker for the team.
And theoretically this year also, again, we're assuming that there's not going to be a ton of injuries and stuff. Syracuse shouldn't be as undersized on the defensive line as it was in the middle end of the season, which means then that Syracuse won't have to necessarily do all of the stunting that it had to do on the defensive line, that it had to just out of necessity to try and get a good matchup. It could be a more mix in a straight up versus a stunt on your rushing, which is what allowed Syracuse to be so effective in the first part of the season. And now you have the addition of Terry Lockett and Braylon Ingraham on that defensive line. I say addition to Terry Lockett because he was out for the last 2/3 of the season. You have Terry Lockett back, you bring in Braylon Ingraham. And so theoretically, just having those two guys, that's two near 300 or over 300 pounders to help on that defensive line. And as we know, the focus of the 3-3-5 defense is the linebackers. And when you have a guy that literally invented the defense coaching those guys, that can only help as well. And so, and especially and we talked a lot about high ceiling guys. I'm really high on both Leon Lowry and Dan Ross Sparrow. And so I don't necessarily think there's going to be as big of a drop off if Thompson isn't available, because one of those two guys is going to pop off, I think, this season. It would just be another feather in Syracuse's cap that would strengthen their defense even more. And while we also say a lot that you don't necessarily need a defensive line to have production, there has to be something from those guys, because what we saw last year, a big reason why also the defense fell off towards the end of the season, is that they just couldn't stop the run. And that was a lot because of the undersized backups that came into play.
Yep.
And so the first point of contact there is the defensive line. And so those guys need to step up and help stop the run. And if they can do that well, then you feel really good about this being a very good defense. Even with Thompson injury or not.
I think that we're in for a really fun week this week. It's going to be the first full week of Syracuse camp work. So again, stay tuned to noonsmagician.com and to our friends over at syracuse.com for what should be a really interesting time as we are officially in football season, as we just did an entire hour-long podcast without bringing up basketball in any way, shape, or form, as God intended. So with that, for Christian de Guzman and for myself and for the currently dealing with old man problems, Steve Haller, we
on the
are
injured list.
On the injured list, he is currently in a non-contact jersey. Hopefully he'll come back. There is no timetable for his return either, but we hope to see him back here next week. We are the Disloyal Idiots podcast, a Fans First Nation podcast. We appreciate the support as always. If you are listening to this on your podcast provider of choice, make sure that you like and subscribe and help us trick the AI into expanding the Ottoman Empire. If you're watching this on our friends at noonsmagician.com, thank you again for the continued support. We really do appreciate you consuming our content over there. Again, thank you to our sponsor, Home Field Apparel, Nunes23, NUNES23 at homefieldapparel.com to get 15% off your first order at Home Field Apparel. And as always, happy football season. This is when Christian, Steve, myself, and I really begin to cook. We're really excited for, I think this will be the 4th season that we're doing this in some capacity together, which is really exciting. I think we're going to do a lot of cool things this year, and I'm really looking forward to it. So thank you so much. Go Orange.
Go Orange.